In the annals of Roman history, emperors have fallen to assassins' blades, poisoned wine, and enemy swords. But one emperor's demise stands apart in its grotesque peculiarity. This is the story of Claudius II Gothicus, a warrior who defeated barbarian hordes but could not conquer his own body. This is the story of 40 days of agony that ended in an explosion that would horrify even the most hardened Roman physician. The year was 270 AD, and Rome was crumbling. The empire that once stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia was now fracturing under the weight of endless invasions, economic collapse, and political chaos. Historians would later call this the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period when Rome produced more than 50 emperors, most of whom died violently. The average reign lasted less than 3 years. In this crucible of instability, Marcus Aurelius Claudius rose to power, a soldier from Illyria who would earn the name Gothicus for his victories against the Gothic tribes threatening Rome's northern frontier. Claudius II was not born into privilege. Unlike the aristocratic emperors of Rome's golden age, he emerged from the military ranks, a career officer who understood warfare from the ground up. His soldiers loved him because he shared their hardships, ate their rations, and led from the front lines. When he seized the purple imperial toga in 268 AD, Rome desperately needed such a leader. The Goths, Alemanni, and other Germanic tribes were pouring across the Danube, pillaging cities and threatening the very heart of the empire. Within 2 years, Claudius proved himself worthy of the imperial title. At the Battle of Naissus in 269 AD, he commanded Roman legions against a Gothic force estimated at over 300,000 warriors. The battle raged for days, transforming the Balkan plains into a slaughterhouse. Roman discipline and tactics eventually prevailed, and the Gothic invasion was shattered. 50,000 barbarian warriors lay dead on the field, and the remainder fled back across the Danube. Rome celebrated, and Claudius earned his cognomen, Gothicus, conqueror of the Goths. But victory came at a terrible price. The campaign had been brutal and protracted. Claudius and his men had marched for months through hostile territory, living on diminished rations and whatever they could forage. Water was often scarce, and the emperor himself reportedly went days drinking only wine, heavily diluted with whatever water could be found. The soldiers suffered from dysentery, malaria, and wounds that festered in the field. Claudius, ever the soldiers' emperor, refused special treatment. He ate what they ate, slept where they slept, and when food ran low, he rationed himself as strictly as any legionnaire. It was during this campaign that Claudius first began to experience digestive troubles. The combination of irregular meals, contaminated water, and the stress of command began to take its toll on his system. Ancient sources mention that the emperor complained of stomach pains and difficulty with his bowels, but he dismissed these concerns as trivial compared to the military crisis at hand. Roman culture placed immense value on stoic endurance of pain, and for an emperor to show weakness over such a common ailment would have been unthinkable. So Claudius suffered in silence, attributing his discomfort to the rigors of campaign life. After the victory at Naissus, Claudius returned to Sirmium, a major Roman city in Pannonia that served as his military headquarters. He was exhausted, weathered by months of warfare, but Rome still faced threats. The Alemanni were raiding in northern Italy, and rumors suggested the Vandals were gathering forces for another invasion. Claudius could not rest. He immediately began planning the next campaign, reviewing troop dispositions, meeting with officers, and corresponding with provincial governors. His physicians urged him to recuperate, to allow his body time to recover from the campaign's hardships, but the emperor dismissed their concerns with characteristic stubbornness. It was in Sirmium, in the late summer of 270 AD, that Claudius's condition began to deteriorate rapidly. What had been occasional discomfort became persistent pain. His bowel movements, already irregular, became increasingly difficult and eventually ceased altogether. This was not uncommon in the ancient world, where diet consisted primarily of grains, meat, and wine, with limited fresh vegetables. But what began as simple constipation quickly evolved into something far more sinister. Within a week, the emperor found himself completely unable to evacuate his bowels, and the pain in his abdomen grew from discomfort to agony. The imperial physician, Gaius Julius Callistus, was summoned to attend the emperor immediately. Callistus was among Rome's most respected medical practitioners, trained in the tradition of Galen and Hippocrates, with decades of experience treating everything from battlefield wounds to palace ailments. When he first examined Claudius, he found the emperor's abdomen distended and hard to the touch, tender in all quadrants. The emperor's face was flushed with fever, and he complained of severe cramping that came in waves, each more intense than the last. Callistus began with the standard Roman treatments for constipation. He prepared a purgative mixture of senna leaves, aloe, and colocynth, a powerful combination that typically produced results within hours. Claudius drank the bitter concoction without complaint, but hours passed with no effect. The physician then tried oil infusions, having the emperor drink copious amounts of olive oil to lubricate the intestinal tract. Again, nothing. By the third day, Callistus was deeply concerned. He had never encountered a case of constipation so resistant to treatment. The Roman medical understanding of digestion was rudimentary by modern standards, but not without merit. Physicians recognized the importance of regular elimination and understood that extended retention of waste could poison the body. Galen, the great medical authority whose writings dominated Roman medicine, had written extensively about intestinal blockages and their dangers. Callistus consulted his copies of Galen's works, searching for guidance on severe cases. The texts recommended more aggressive interventions, manual extraction, enemas with more powerful substances, and even surgical options in extreme circumstances. On the fifth day, Callistus attempted manual extraction. With the emperor lying on his side, the physician used oils and instruments to try to manually clear the blockage. The procedure was agonizing for Claudius, who gripped the edges of his bed so tightly his knuckles turned white. Servants held him still as Callistus worked, but despite his best efforts, he could feel nothing but hardened, impacted material that would not budge. The emperor's rectum had become as hard as stone, and any attempt to force passage caused such intense pain that Claudius screamed and begged for the procedure to stop. Desperate, Callistus turned to enemas, but not the gentle solutions modern medicine might employ. Roman medicine favored aggressive treatments, believing that powerful remedies were necessary for severe ailments. He prepared mixtures of vinegar, salt water, and various herbs known for their purgative properties. These solutions were administered with a bronze clyster, a device consisting of a hollow tube connected to a bladder filled with the medicinal liquid. The solution was forced into the rectum with considerable pressure, the theory being that the liquid would soften the impacted material and force it out. The first enema produced nothing but agonized cries from the emperor. The liquid had nowhere to go. Blocked by the hardened mass in Claudius's lower intestine, it backed up, causing such severe cramping that the emperor vomited, adding to his misery. Callistus tried again the next day with an even more potent mixture, this time adding bile from an ox, believing it would help dissolve the obstruction. The result was the same: excruciating pain and no relief. By the seventh day, Claudius was begging the physician to stop the treatments, saying he would rather die than endure another enema. Word of the emperor's condition could not be kept secret for long. The imperial palace at Sirmium was a hive of activity, with servants, soldiers, administrators, and courtiers constantly moving through its halls. Claudius's screams during treatments echoed through the marble corridors, and servants who attended him emerged pale and shaken, Rumors began to spread through the city. Some said the emperor had been poisoned by enemies at court. Others whispered that he had been cursed by the gods, divine punishment for some unknown transgression. The most pessimistic claimed he was dying, and ambitious men began quietly positioning themselves for the inevitable succession crisis. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers responsible for protecting the emperor, grew increasingly anxious. Their loyalty to Claudius was genuine. He had been one of them, a soldier who rose through merit rather than birth. But the sounds and smells emanating from the imperial chambers were deeply disturbing. Praetorians stationed outside the emperor's door reported a stench of decay that grew stronger each day, a fetid odor unlike anything they had encountered. Some refused their posts, claiming the smell made them physically ill. Officers had to rotate guards more frequently, and even hardened veterans who had faced Gothic berserkers in battle found their nerve tested by whatever horror was unfolding inside. By the 10th day, Claudius's condition had transformed from a medical crisis into a nightmare that defied all logic and experience. His abdomen, which had been merely distended, now swelled grotesquely, pushing against his skin until it was stretched taut and shiny. The emperor could no longer lie flat. Even the slightest pressure on his stomach caused unbearable pain. He had to remain propped up on cushions, sitting at an angle that minimized the pressure on his tortured organs. Sleep became impossible. Every few minutes, waves of cramping would seize him, causing his entire body to convulse with pain. Callistus observed with growing horror as his patient's symptoms worsened. The fever that had been intermittent now burned constantly. Claudius's skin took on a grayish pallor, and his eyes became sunken and glazed. Most alarming was the emperor's mental state. Claudius, renowned for his clarity of thought and decisive leadership, began to drift in and out of lucidity. He would be conversing rationally one moment, discussing military matters or asking about affairs of state, and then suddenly cry out in pain and confusion, speaking of people and places that made no sense. The physician knew he was witnessing something unprecedented. In all his years of practice, through wars and plagues, he had never seen a case of constipation develop into such a catastrophic condition. Callistus began to suspect that this was not simple constipation, but something far more sinister. Perhaps a tumor was blocking the intestines, or the intestinal walls themselves had somehow ceased to function. Without the benefit of modern diagnostic tools, he could only theorize, and each theory was more disturbing than the last. Other physicians were summoned from across the region. Rome's medical establishment descended on Sirmium, each practitioner bringing their own theories and treatments. One physician, trained in the Greek tradition, advocated for bloodletting, arguing that the emperor's humors were badly out of balance and needed to be re-equilibrated. He opened a vein in Claudius's arm and drained a substantial amount of blood into a bronze bowl. The emperor, already weakened, became lightheaded and nearly fainted, but the treatment did nothing to address the fundamental problem. Another physician, who claimed to have studied with Eastern mystics, suggested that the blockage was spiritual rather than physical. He performed elaborate rituals, burning incense and chanting prayers to Asclepius, the god of healing. He placed amulets on the emperor's body and prepared potions containing powdered gems and exotic herbs from beyond the empire's borders. Claudius, desperate for any relief, submitted to these treatments despite his skepticism. Days passed, and the rituals proved as ineffective as everything else. A surgeon was consulted, a Greek named Diocles, who had earned a fearsome reputation for his willingness to attempt procedures other physicians considered too dangerous. He examined Claudius carefully, pressing on the distended abdomen and trying to map the contours of the blockage. Diocles proposed cutting into the emperor's abdomen to manually remove the obstruction. It was an incredibly risky procedure. Abdominal surgery in the ancient world almost always led to fatal infections. Without anesthesia beyond wine and opium, the pain would be unimaginable. And without knowledge of antiseptic technique, the chances of survival were minimal. Callistus was horrified by the suggestion. He argued passionately against the surgery, pointing out that it would almost certainly kill the emperor. But Diocles countered that Claudius was dying anyway, and at least the surgery offered a chance, however slim. A heated debate erupted among the assembled physicians, with voices raised in the very corridors where the emperor lay suffering. Ultimately, it was Claudius himself who ended the discussion. In a moment of clarity, he refused the surgery, saying he would not die screaming on a surgeon's table like a battlefield casualty. He would endure, he insisted, believing that his body would eventually heal itself, but his body was not healing. By the 15th day, Claudius could no longer eat solid food. Anything he swallowed seemed to have nowhere to go, and he would vomit it back up within hours. His diet was reduced to broth and wine, barely enough to sustain him. His weight began to drop alarmingly, his face becoming gaunt, even as his belly swelled larger. He looked like a grotesque caricature, a skeleton with a pregnant belly, his limbs wasting away while his abdomen expanded like some parasitic growth, consuming him from within. The palace at Sirmium had become a place of dread. Servants moved through the halls in hushed whispers, crossing themselves or making warding signs against evil. The stench that emanated from the imperial quarters grew so powerful that incense burners were placed throughout the building, filling the air with thick, cloying smoke in a futile attempt to mask the smell of decay. But nothing could fully cover it. The odor crept through every corridor, a constant reminder that something terrible was happening to the emperor. Claudius's wife, whose name has been lost to history, kept vigil by his bedside, despite the horror of his condition. Ancient sources describe her as devoted but increasingly desperate, praying constantly to every god in the Roman pantheon for her husband's relief. She commissioned sacrifices at temples throughout the city, slaughtering bulls and sheep in honor of Jupiter, Mars, and Asclepius. She consulted oracles and fortune-tellers, seeking any divine insight into her husband's affliction. But the gods remained silent, or perhaps their answer was in the very suffering they witnessed. The emperor's closest advisors struggled to maintain the functioning of government, while their leader deteriorated. Military dispatches still required attention, provincial governors sent reports needing decisions, and the constant threat of invasion demanded strategic planning. A small council of Claudius's most trusted generals attempted to handle these matters, but without the emperor's authority, their decisions lacked weight. Rumors spread throughout the empire that the emperor was incapacitated, or possibly already dead, and in the volatile political climate of the 3rd century, such rumors could spark rebellions. By the 20th day, Claudius had lost all control of his bodily functions, except for the one that tormented him most. He urinated rarely, producing only small amounts of dark, foul-smelling liquid. His bowels remained completely obstructed, a fact that had become the central horror of his existence. But now, fluid began to seep from his rectum, a thin, watery discharge that smelled of death itself. Callistus recognized this as a terrible sign. The tissues of the intestine were beginning to necrotize, to die and liquefy, and what was leaking out was the product of that decay. The physician knew with certainty now that his patient was dying. The question was no longer if, but when and how. He confided in his colleagues that the emperor's intestines were likely gangrenous, that the prolonged blockage had cut off blood flow to portions of the bowel, causing the tissue to rot. In a modern hospital, emergency surgery might save such a patient, but in 270 AD, there was no intervention that could help. All they could do was try to manage the pain and wait for the inevitable end. Opium became Claudius's constant companion. The poppy extract, imported at great expense from Asia Minor, was the most powerful analgesic available to Roman medicine. Callistus prepared increasingly strong doses, mixing the opium with wine and having the emperor drink it several times daily. The drug brought some relief, dulling the worst of the pain and allowing Claudius brief periods of something approaching rest. But it also accelerated his mental deterioration. The emperor began having vivid hallucinations, seeing enemies in the shadows and reliving battles from his past. In his more lucid moments, Claudius tried to set his affairs in order. He dictated messages to his generals, giving instructions for defending the empire after his death. He spoke of his successor, though ancient sources disagree on whether he formally designated anyone. Some claim he favored Quintillus, his brother, while others suggest he had identified Aurelian, one of his most capable generals. But these conversations were fragmentary and confused, interrupted constantly by waves of pain that left the emperor screaming and incoherent. The Praetorian Guard prepared for the worst. Their prefect, a veteran officer named Flavius, began quietly making arrangements for the succession crisis that would inevitably follow Claudius's death. He met with senior military commanders, trying to forge a consensus on who should take the purple. But consensus was elusive. The empire was too fragmented. Too many ambitious men saw an opportunity in the emperor's impending death. Flavius knew that civil war was a real possibility, and the empire, already weakened by years of invasion and instability, might not survive another round of internal conflict. On the 25th day, something shifted in Claudius's condition. The constant, agonizing pain that had dominated his every waking moment intensified to a level that seemed beyond what any human could endure. His screams, which had become sickeningly familiar to everyone in the palace, took on a new quality, a raw, primal sound that seemed to come from somewhere beyond consciousness. Servants who heard these cries crossed themselves and whispered that the emperor was being torn apart by demons. Callistus, examining his patient, felt a new development in the emperor's abdomen. Where before the swelling had been relatively uniform, now he could feel distinct, hard masses pushing against the abdominal wall. The intestines, packed with weeks of accumulated waste and dying tissue, were beginning to press against the peritoneum, the membrane lining the abdominal cavity. The physician knew that if the intestines perforated, if they ruptured through the peritoneum, the result would be catastrophic. The contents of the gut would spill into the abdominal cavity, causing a massive infection that would be rapidly fatal. The emperor's fever spiked higher. His temperature, which had been elevated for weeks, now climbed to levels that caused convulsions. Claudius shook uncontrollably, his teeth chattering, his body drenched in sweat despite the coolness of the chamber. Slaves stood by with wet cloths, constantly wiping his face and body in a futile attempt to cool him. His pulse, which Callistus checked obsessively, became rapid and thready, a sign that the body's vital systems were beginning to fail. Claudius began to speak of death openly. In rare moments when the opium granted him clarity, he would talk about his life, his campaigns, his regrets. He spoke of soldiers he had commanded, men who had died under his orders, and wondered aloud if their shades were waiting for him in the underworld. He asked Callistus directly how much longer he would suffer, pleading to know when death would finally release him. The physician, who had always been honest with his patient, could only say that he did not know, that each day the emperor survived was beyond what medical knowledge would predict. The psychological toll on everyone in the palace was immense. Watching a strong, vital man reduced to a screaming, incontinent wreck destroyed any illusions about the dignity of death. The emperor, who had commanded legions and defeated barbarian hordes, was being destroyed by his own body in the most humiliating way imaginable. His suffering was so extreme, so prolonged, that it seemed designed by some malicious deity as a cosmic joke. What glory was there in this death? What honor? The soldier emperor was being defeated not by enemy swords, but by his own intestines. Religious officials were summoned to perform purification rituals. Perhaps some suggested the palace itself was cursed, and the emperor's suffering was a manifestation of divine displeasure. Priests of Jupiter and Mars conducted elaborate ceremonies, sacrificing animals and reading their entrails for omens. The signs, they reported, were dire. The gods were angry, though about what the priests could not say. Some whispered that Claudius had offended the gods by his ambition, that no mortal should rise as high as he had without paying a terrible price. In the city beyond the palace walls, normal life struggled to continue. Sirmium was a major urban center, a hub of trade and military administration, and it could not simply stop functioning because the emperor was dying. But the atmosphere was oppressive. Everyone knew what was happening in the imperial palace, and the knowledge hung over the city like a dark cloud. Markets still operated, but merchants spoke in hushed tones. Taverns stayed open, but the usual boisterous atmosphere was subdued. The city waited, dreading the moment when official word would come that the emperor was dead. By the 30th day, Claudius had transcended normal human suffering. His body had become a prison of agony, each moment an eternity of pain that no opium dose could fully mask. His abdomen had swollen to such grotesque proportions that he looked pregnant with some monstrous offspring. The skin was stretched so tight it had become translucent in places, showing the dark masses of distended intestines beneath. His navel, pushed outward by the internal pressure, protruded obscenely. The stench was overwhelming, a concentrated essence of death that caused strong men to retch. The final 10 days of Claudius's life descended into a hell that beggared description. The emperor's mental state, which had been deteriorating gradually, now collapsed completely. The pain and fever combined with constant doses of opium created a nightmarish landscape in his mind where past and present blended into incoherent horror. He would suddenly sit up, as much as his swollen body allowed, and scream orders to long-dead legionaries. He fought invisible battles, his arms flailing weakly at enemies only he could see. Then, just as suddenly, he would collapse back onto his cushions, weeping like a child. Callistus had long since abandoned any pretense of treatment. There was nothing left to try, no intervention that had not already failed. His role had devolved into simple witness, a chronicler of unprecedented medical horror. He made notes obsessively, documenting every symptom, every change in the emperor's condition. Some part of him, trained as a physician to learn from every case, wanted this suffering to at least serve some educational purpose. Perhaps future doctors, reading his account, might recognize the signs earlier and intervene more successfully. But he knew, even as he wrote, that this case was probably unique, a perfect storm of circumstances that might never be replicated. The emperor's wife could no longer bear to stay in the room continuously. The combination of sight, smell, and sound overwhelmed her. She would sit with her husband for as long as she could endure, holding his hand, speaking soothing words he could no longer hear. But eventually, she would flee the chamber, stumbling into adjacent rooms where she would weep uncontrollably. The woman who had stood beside an emperor, who had hosted senators and generals, who had presented an image of imperial dignity, was broken by watching her husband's protracted destruction. On the 32nd day, Claudius began vomiting fecal matter. The obstruction was now so complete, the intestines so backed up, that the only path for the contents of his gut was upward. This was perhaps the most horrifying development yet, a sign that the body's normal functions had reversed entirely. The emperor vomited repeatedly, bringing up material that should have been expelled from the opposite end of his digestive tract weeks ago. The smell was indescribable, overwhelming even the incense and perfumes that filled the chamber. Servants assigned to clean up after these episodes had to be physically forced to enter the room, and more than one fled their posts entirely, preferring punishment to enduring such horror. The fluid accumulating in Claudius's abdomen began to affect his breathing. The distended intestines pushed upward against his diaphragm, restricting the movement of his lungs. Each breath became a struggle, a conscious effort to draw in air. The emperor gasped and wheezed, his chest heaving as he fought for oxygen. Callistus recognized this as another terminal sign. When a patient could no longer breathe properly, death was imminent. Yet somehow, impossibly, Claudius continued to live, his body refusing to surrender even as it destroyed itself. Word had spread throughout the Roman world that the emperor was dying. Dispatches from Sirmium reached Rome, carrying the news to the Senate and the people. In the capital, preparations began for imperial succession, though no one knew exactly who would emerge as the next emperor. Provincial governors received the news with trepidation, knowing that the death of an emperor often meant civil war, rebellions, and invasions by opportunistic barbarians. The empire held its collective breath, waiting for official word from Sirmium. On the 35th day, Claudius's skin began to yellow. Jaundice, caused by liver failure as toxins built up in his bloodstream, gave him a sickly, corpse-like appearance even while he yet lived. His eyes, sunken deep in their sockets, took on a yellowish tint. Combined with his skeletal face and grotesquely swollen abdomen, he looked less like a living man and more like some animated corpse from the worst kind of nightmare. Guards posted outside his chamber, catching glimpses of the emperor when servants entered or left, would turn away in horror, unable to reconcile the creature they saw with the vital, commanding figure they had served. The emperor's urine, the small amounts he still produced, turned dark as rust. His kidneys, poisoned by the toxins flooding his system, were failing. Callistus knew that once the kidneys ceased functioning entirely, death would follow quickly. But quickly had lost all meaning in this ordeal. Each day that Claudius survived seemed impossible, yet each dawn found him still alive, still suffering. It was as if death itself was toying with him, prolonging his agony for reasons no mortal could fathom. Claudius developed bed sores, despite the best efforts of his attendants to prevent them. Unable to move himself, even shifting his position without help, his skin broke down where it pressed against the bed. The sores became infected, adding another layer of misery to his condition. His back, hips, and shoulders developed oozing wounds that had to be cleaned and dressed regularly. Each treatment caused additional pain, and the emperor would moan and cry throughout the process. The attendants, many of whom had served Claudius for years and genuinely cared for him, wept openly as they performed these necessary cruelties. On the 37th day, something changed in the quality of the emperor's suffering. The constant screaming that had characterized the previous weeks diminished. This was not because the pain had lessened, but because Claudius no longer had the strength to scream. His voice had been reduced to a hoarse whisper, and when waves of agony seized him, he could only gasp and moan weakly. This somehow made his suffering more horrible to witness. The screams, as terrible as they were, had at least been expressions of resistance, signs of a man still fighting. The silence meant he was giving up, that his body was finally surrendering to the inevitable. Callistus could feel changes in the emperor's abdomen that filled him with dread. The hard masses of impacted material seemed to be shifting, pressing more forcefully against the abdominal wall. He could almost see the shape of distended intestines through the translucent skin. The pressure was building to catastrophic levels, and the physician knew that something had to give. Either the obstruction would somehow clear, which seemed impossible after 5 weeks, or the intestines would rupture. And if they ruptured, the emperor would die in agony as his abdominal cavity filled with decades of accumulated waste. The emperor's heartbeat became erratic. Callistus, checking his patient's pulse multiple times per hour, felt the rhythm change from rapid and thready to irregular and unpredictable. Sometimes the heart would race, beating so fast it seemed impossible it could sustain the pace. Other times, it would slow dramatically, the pauses between beats extending until the physician thought each one might be the last. The emperor's body was in the final stages of systemic failure, each organ system shutting down in sequence as toxins overwhelmed the body's defenses. Claudius's extremities grew cold. His hands and feet, starved of blood as his body prioritized vital organs, became icy to the touch despite the warmth of the chamber. His fingernails and toenails took on a bluish tint, a sign of severe oxygen deprivation. His breathing, already labored, became even more irregular, with long pauses between breaths that made observers wonder if he had finally died. But each time, just when it seemed he had drawn his last breath, he would gasp again, dragging more air into his tortured lungs. The Praetorian Guard, recognizing that the end was near, increased security around the palace. The death of an emperor was always a moment of vulnerability, a time when ambitious rivals might attempt coups or assassinations. Officers armed with swords stood at every entrance, and soldiers patrolled the corridors in shifts. No one was allowed to enter or leave the imperial quarters without authorization. The prefect, Flavius, took personal command of the emperor's protection, determined that whatever death came for Claudius, it would not be at the hands of an assassin or conspirator. In the pre-dawn hours of the 38th day, Claudius opened his eyes with unexpected clarity. For a brief moment, the fog of opium and fever lifted, and he seemed to truly see the people around him for the first time in days. He looked at Callistus, at his wife, at the attendants and guards in the room. His lips moved, and those present leaned close to hear his whispered words. "Let me die," he said, his voice barely audible. "Please, let me die." It was a plea from the depths of despair, a man begging for release from suffering that had transcended all bounds of endurance. But they could not grant his wish. Roman medicine had no concept of euthanasia for terminal patients. To actively end a life, even a life mired in hopeless suffering, was murder. All they could do was continue administering opium, offering what comfort they could, and wait for nature to take its course. Claudius's wife sobbed as she kissed his forehead, whispering assurances that his suffering would end soon, that the gods would be merciful. But her words rang hollow, even to her own ears. If the gods were merciful, they would have ended this ordeal weeks ago. The emperor slipped back into delirium, the moment of clarity lost as quickly as it had appeared. He began muttering again, speaking words no one could understand, his voice rising and falling in pitch as he conversed with phantoms only he could perceive. His hands clutched at the air, grasping at things that were not there. Occasionally, he would call out names, soldiers who had died in his campaigns, or family members from his childhood. He was no longer present in the room. His mind had retreated to some other place, perhaps mercifully spared the awareness of his body's ongoing destruction. The 39th day dawned grey and cold, winter asserting itself over Pannonia. Inside the imperial chamber, the season was irrelevant. The room existed in its own timeless hell, sealed off from the natural world by marble walls that held in the stench of decay and the sounds of suffering. Claudius lay on his bed, more corpse than man, sustained by nothing more than his body's stubborn refusal to acknowledge that it was already dead. His chest rose and fell in irregular patterns, each breath a separate victory against the forces pulling him toward oblivion. Callistus had not slept in days. He sat beside his patient's bed, watching with red-rimmed eyes, documenting every change, no matter how small. His hands trembled as he wrote, exhaustion and horror combining to make each word a struggle. He had witnessed death many times in his career, had attended patients through plague and battlefield injuries, but nothing had prepared him for this protracted nightmare. He found himself praying for the emperor's death, begging whatever gods might listen to end this spectacle of suffering. That afternoon, Claudius's fever spiked higher than ever before. His temperature climbed so high that his skin felt like heated metal. Attendants brought buckets of cold water, soaking cloths and laying them across his body in a desperate attempt to cool him. But the fever would not break. It was as if the emperor was burning from within, his body literally cooking itself. His eyes, still partially open, seemed to bulge from their sockets, and thin streams of blood began to seep from his nose and ears as the heat damaged delicate blood vessels. Around sunset, a change occurred that made everyone in the room freeze with terror. Claudius's abdomen, which had been merely distended, suddenly bulged outward dramatically on the left side. It was as if something inside had shifted position, creating a grotesque asymmetry. Callistus placed his hand on the area and felt something moving beneath the skin, a sick, fluid motion that should not be possible. He realized with horror that the intestinal wall must have given way internally, that loops of bowel were no longer held in their proper position by the mesentery that normally suspended them in the abdominal cavity. The emperor's breathing changed again, becoming rapid and shallow, almost panting. His lips moved constantly, though no sound emerged. His eyes, unfocused and glazed, darted back and forth as if tracking movement no one else could see. Foam appeared at the corners of his mouth, tinged pink with blood. His hands, which had been limp for hours, suddenly clenched into fists, his entire body going rigid with a tension that seemed impossible given his weakened state. As night fell on the 39th day, everyone in the palace knew that the end was near. There was a palpable sense of anticipation, of waiting for a storm that must break. Servants moved through the halls like ghosts, speaking in whispers if they spoke at all. Praetorian guards stood at rigid attention, their faces set in expressions of grim determination. In the city beyond the palace, taverns were unusually quiet, and priests at various temples reported increased attendance as citizens sought solace or understanding in the face of their emperor's suffering. Claudius's wife refused to leave the chamber now. She sat beside the bed, holding her husband's hand, speaking to him constantly, even though he gave no sign of hearing. She told him about the days of their courtship, reminded him of his victories, assured him that Rome would remember him as a great emperor. Whether he understood any of her words was impossible to say. His eyes remained unfocused, and his only responses were the involuntary twitches and gasps that punctuated his labored breathing. Just before midnight, Claudius opened his mouth as if to speak, but instead of words, he vomited again, this time bringing up material that was almost pure blood. The hemorrhaging that had started with small bleeds from his nose and ears had progressed internally. His stomach, stressed by weeks of trying to process material that couldn't pass through his obstructed intestines, had finally given way, its lining eroding under the constant assault of bile and acid. The blood that filled his mouth was from ulcerations that had perforated through the stomach wall. The vomiting triggered something. Claudius's body convulsed violently, his back arching off the bed despite the swollen abdomen that should have made such movement impossible. His hands clawed at his belly, fingers digging into the distended flesh as if he could somehow tear out whatever was tormenting him from the inside. A low, guttural sound emerged from his throat, building in intensity until it became a scream that echoed through the palace, a sound of such primal agony that guards in distant corridors felt their blood run cold. The 40th day began in the darkest hours before dawn. In the imperial chamber, lit by dozens of oil lamps that cast flickering shadows across the walls, Claudius lay in his bed, every breath a visible struggle. His chest heaved erratically, and his mouth hung open as he gasped for air. The swelling of his abdomen had reached truly obscene proportions, his belly now so distended that it seemed physically impossible for the skin to contain what lay beneath. The surface of the skin showed stretch marks and areas where it had become so thin that the dark shapes of distended intestines were clearly visible. Callistus stood back from the bed, having exhausted every intervention he could conceive. There was nothing left to do but bear witness. He had spent the night in prayer, not to Asclepius the healer, but to Thanatos, the god of peaceful death, begging that Claudius be granted a swift end. But the gods, if they heard his prayers, seemed determined to extract every last moment of suffering from the dying emperor. Claudius lingered in a state that defied all medical understanding, his body trapped in the liminal space between life and death. Around 4 in the morning, Claudius's eyes opened fully for the first time in days. There was a terrible lucidity in his gaze, a final moment of consciousness before the end. He looked around the room, seeming to register where he was and what was happening. His gaze fell on his physician, and Callistus saw recognition in those bloodshot eyes. The emperor tried to speak, his lips forming words, but his voice was too weak to produce sound. Callistus leaned close, his ear nearly touching the emperor's lips, and heard 3 words, barely a whisper. "It's coming. Now." The physician straightened up, a chill running down his spine. He didn't know if Claudius meant death was coming or something else, but the certainty in those words was absolute. The emperor knew something was about to happen, some culmination of the torture his body had endured for 40 days. Callistus backed away from the bed, motioning for others in the room to do the same. Some instinct told him that they should not be too close to Claudius in these final moments. For several minutes, nothing happened. Claudius lay still, his eyes now closed again, his breathing shallow but steady. The tension in the room built to nearly unbearable levels. Then, at approximately 4:23 in the morning by the water clock in the corner of the room, Claudius's body went rigid. Every muscle tensed simultaneously, his back arching, his hands gripping the sheets with enough force to tear the fabric. His eyes flew open, showing nothing but whites. The pupils rolled back into his head. The scream that emerged from the emperor was unlike anything that had come before. It was not a human sound. It was something deeper, more primal, a vocalization of agony that transcended language or conscious thought. The scream rose in pitch and volume, filling the chamber and spilling out into the corridors beyond. A sustained note of pure suffering that seemed impossible to produce with human lungs. Guards in distant parts of the palace would later report hearing it, a cry that made grown soldiers reach for their swords and look around for enemies. And then it happened. With a sound like tearing fabric amplified 1,000 times, Claudius's abdomen ruptured. The skin, stretched beyond all capacity, simply gave way. The explosion was not a sudden burst, but a rapid tearing, the flesh splitting open along the midline of the abdomen from just below the sternum down to the pubic bone. What emerged was a nightmare made real, a flood of material that should never have seen light. Blood came first, dark and clotted, followed by bile, greenish-yellow and reeking. But then came the accumulated contents of 40 days of obstruction. Fecal matter, some solid, some liquefied, mixed with pus from necrotic tissue, fragments of sloughed intestinal lining, and fluids that defied identification. The mass of material poured from the opened abdomen onto the bed, onto the floor, a torrent of corruption that seemed impossible to have been contained within a human body. The volume was staggering. Witnesses would later estimate that several gallons of material evacuated from the emperor's ruptured gut. The smell that accompanied this eruption was beyond description. It was not merely the smell of feces or decay, it was the concentrated essence of death itself, the products of tissue that had been decomposing inside a living body for weeks. Several people in the room immediately vomited. Others fled, unable to endure the sensory assault. The oil lamps seemed to dim in the presence of such concentrated corruption, as if the very air had become thick and dark with miasma. Through it all, Claudius was still alive. His scream had died away to a gasping moan, and his eyes, though open, saw nothing. Blood poured from the wound in his abdomen, but mixed with so much other material that it was hard to distinguish. His hands twitched feebly, and his feet moved in small, random spasms. The human body, even when catastrophically damaged, does not die instantly. There were long seconds, perhaps as much as a minute, during which Claudius remained conscious, aware on some level that his body had literally exploded, that his intestines were now outside his body, spread across the bed in a grotesque display. Finally, mercifully, his eyes glazed over. The slight movements of his hands and feet ceased. His breathing, which had continued even after the rupture, suddenly stopped. Claudius II, Gothicus, conqueror of the Goths, emperor of Rome, died at 4:25 in the morning on the 40th day of his constipation, his body destroyed in a manner that would horrify physicians and historians for centuries to come. The aftermath of Claudius's death was almost as chaotic as his dying. The servants who had been in the room when the rupture occurred stumbled out into the corridors, some screaming, others silent with shock. Word spread through the palace in minutes. The emperor was dead, and his death had been unnatural, horrific, something that defied explanation or precedent. Guards who had not witnessed the event demanded to know what had happened. but those who had seen it found themselves unable to adequately describe what they had witnessed. Callistus, covered in the products of the emperor's exploded abdomen, stood in the doorway of the death chamber, looking back at the scene of carnage. His medical training compelled him to document what had occurred, but his hands shook too badly to hold a stylus. He had witnessed death in countless forms throughout his career, but this exceeded all bounds of medical horror. This was not a natural death, not even a death from disease. This was a body destroying itself in the most violent way possible, an internal catastrophe that turned a living human into a vessel of corruption that ultimately could not contain what festered within. The body itself presented a problem that no one wanted to address. Tradition required that an emperor's body be prepared for funeral rites, washed and dressed in imperial regalia, displayed for the people to mourn. But Claudius's corpse was in no condition for such treatment. The abdomen was split open, the cavity emptied, the intestines visible and damaged beyond repair. The massive wound could not simply be sewn shut. There was too much missing tissue, too much damage. And the smell, the awful pervasive smell, clung to everything, soaking into the bedding, the floor, even the walls. A decision was made quickly, without formal authorization, born of desperation and horror. The body would be wrapped immediately in multiple layers of thick cloth, sealed in a lead coffin, and removed from the palace as quickly as possible. There would be no lying in state, no public viewing. The official story would be that the emperor had died of plague, a common enough affliction that would explain the need for hasty burial and limited access to the body. No one needed to know the grotesque truth of how Rome's emperor had actually died. Slaves were ordered to clean the chamber, a task that none wanted. Those selected for the duty had to be physically forced into the room, and even then they could barely function. So overwhelmed were they by the smell and the sight of what had happened. They worked with cloths wrapped around their faces, gagging and retching as they tried to scrub the marble floor and haul away the ruined bedding. The blood could be cleaned, but the smell persisted. Despite their best efforts, the chamber would never be used again. It would be sealed, becoming a forbidden room in the palace, a space too tainted by horror to ever serve any useful purpose. The Praetorian Guard moved swiftly to secure the succession. Flavius, the prefect, met with senior military commanders and announced that Quintillus, Claudius's brother, would assume the purple. It was a logical choice, providing continuity and avoiding the immediate chaos of a disputed succession. But the army in the field had other ideas. Aurelian, commanding the cavalry legions at the frontier, was declared emperor by his troops within weeks. The resulting conflict would be brief. Quintillus would die under mysterious circumstances after only 17 days as emperor, and Aurelian would go on to become one of Rome's most effective rulers. But the manner of Claudius's death could not be kept secret for long. Too many people had witnessed it, or heard the screams, or seen the aftermath. Servants talked to their families, guards gossiped with fellow soldiers, and soon the story was circulating throughout Sirmium. From there, it spread along the trade routes and military supply lines, carried by merchants and soldiers, growing more embellished with each retelling. By the time the tale reached Rome itself, it had become a lurid legend, whispered in taverns and markets. Historians writing in subsequent decades would struggle with how to record this death. Aurelius Victor, writing about 80 years later, mentioned that Claudius had died of plague during his campaign, making no mention of the true cause. The Historia Augusta, a notoriously unreliable collection of imperial biographies, also attributed his death to plague. But other sources, particularly medical texts and letters preserved in private collections, told a different story. These documents spoke of the emperor who died of constipation, whose body exploded after 40 days of obstruction. Medical practitioners studied Callistus's detailed notes on the case, trying to understand what had gone wrong and how it might be prevented in future cases. But the extreme nature of Claudius's condition made it difficult to extract useful lessons. The combination of military campaign stress, Dehydration, poor diet, and possibly some underlying structural abnormality had created a perfect storm that was unlikely to be replicated exactly. Still, the case became a cautionary tale, cited in medical texts as an example of how a seemingly minor ailment could cascade into fatal disaster. The psychological impact on those who witnessed Claudius's death was profound. Callistus, despite his extensive experience, found himself unable to practice medicine for months afterward. He would later write that the emperor's death had shaken his faith in the body's fundamental integrity, that he could no longer look at a human abdomen without imagining the horrors that might be contained within. Several of the attendants who were present in the chamber that final morning reportedly suffered recurring nightmares for years. In the years and centuries that followed, the manner of Claudius II's death became a source of both medical fascination and moral cautionary tale. For physicians, it represented an extreme case that pushed the boundaries of what the human body could endure. Medical writers debated whether anything could have been done differently, whether some intervention might have saved the emperor, or at least granted him a less horrific death. The consensus was generally that once the obstruction had persisted beyond 10 or 15 days, the outcome was probably inevitable. For philosophers and moralists, Claudius's death became a meditation on the nature of suffering and the limits of human endurance. Stoic writers pointed to it as an example of the body's impermanence and the importance of maintaining mental equanimity even in the face of extreme physical distress. Christian writers, as Christianity spread through the empire in subsequent centuries, saw it as evidence of divine judgment, arguing that Claudius's horrible death was punishment for the persecution of Christians during his reign. Though historical evidence of such persecution is actually quite limited, the physical location where Claudius died also took on a grim significance. The palace at Sirmium, once a major imperial residence, began to decline in importance. Subsequent emperors preferred to stay elsewhere when in the region, and gradually the building fell into disrepair. The chamber where Claudius died, which had been sealed immediately after his death, became the subject of local legends. People claimed to hear screams coming from the room on certain nights, or to smell the stench of decay wafting from beneath the sealed door. Whether these claims had any basis in reality or were simply products of the horror story that had grown up around the emperor's death is impossible to say. Modern medical analysis, based on the historical accounts of Claudius's symptoms and death, suggests he likely suffered from a complete intestinal obstruction combined with toxic megacolon, a condition where the colon becomes severely distended and the intestinal wall begins to necrotize. The 40-day duration is extraordinarily long for such a condition. Most patients would have died within 2 weeks from sepsis or perforation. That Claudius survived as long as he did speaks either to an unusual constitution or to peculiarities in his specific case that we cannot now reconstruct. The psychological dimensions of such a death are worth considering. For 40 days, Claudius knew he was dying. He experienced continuous escalating pain, watched his body transform into something monstrous, and endured treatments that were themselves agonizing. He was aware of his own helplessness, conscious of how his suffering diminished his imperial dignity. And all of this occurred in front of witnesses, his most intimate bodily functions becoming matters of public knowledge and discussion. The mental torture of such an ordeal may have been even worse than the physical suffering. From a historical perspective, Claudius's death exemplifies the precarious nature of life in the ancient world. Here was a man at the absolute pinnacle of human power, commander of the greatest empire the world had known, and yet he was completely helpless before a malfunctioning bowel. All the wealth of Rome, all the skills of its physicians, all the prayers to its gods could not save him from a condition that modern medicine could likely treat with relative ease. His death is a reminder that for most of human history, even the powerful were vulnerable to medical catastrophes that we would now consider routine. The impact on Roman governance was also significant, though less direct. Claudius's death and the disputed succession that followed contributed to the ongoing instability of the 3rd century. The fact that such a capable military emperor could be removed from power not by enemies, but by medical catastrophe must have been demoralizing for Roman citizens and soldiers alike. It reinforced the sense that the empire was cursed, that even when Rome produced good leaders, fate conspired to remove them through improbable and horrific means. In the end, the story of Claudius II's death transcends the merely grotesque to become something almost metaphorical. It's a story about the limits of human power, about the body's capacity to become a prison, about the fine line between life and death, and about the sometimes arbitrary nature of how and when we die. Claudius could have died gloriously in battle, remembered forever as a hero who fell defending Rome. Instead, he died in a bed, killed by his own intestines, in a manner so humiliating and horrific that historians preferred to lie about it rather than record the truth. The emperor who conquered the Goths was conquered by his own body. The general who commanded legions could not command his own bowels. The man who had stood at the pinnacle of human achievement was reduced to a screaming, incontinent wreck, his final moments a spectacle of biological horror. In 40 days, Claudius II went from emperor to corpse, and the manner of his dying remains one of the most disturbing medical cases ever recorded. His death reminds us that beneath all our civilizations, all our accomplishments, all our power and glory, we are still mortal bodies subject to failure, decay, and sometimes catastrophic destruction. The emperor's purple robes could not protect him from the biological reality of a malfunctioning intestine. His imperial authority could not command his body to heal. In the end, Marcus Aurelius Claudius, called Gothicus, conqueror and emperor, died as all humans die, defeated by the inevitable failure of flesh and blood.